In 2006, Rob and Vicky Graves, along with their teenage kids, decided to look for a property in suburban Indiana, as they were tired of the city's fast paced lifestyle. During their property search, they stumbled upon a property called Fox Hollow Farms, which was a huge estate but had an abnormally low asking price. Interested in the property, the couple ended up calling the real estate agent and went on a house tour. The family was astonished by the sheer size of this house and the beauty it emitted. While walking around the house, something struck Rob's mind. He remotely remembered hearing that the house belonged to a serial killer named Herb Baumeister. He then stopped the real estate agent and asked him if this house was actually owned by a serial killer. The agent didn't refuse a bit, and even agreed. He told the family that he was expecting them to ask about the killer and proceeded to share with them the history of the house. The house was originally owned by Herb Baumeister, the most notorious serial killer Indiana had ever seen. Baumeister was a completely normal child until the onset of puberty. Right after puberty hit, he started displaying antisocial behavior and started showing an obsession with the dead. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, which was left untreated. Later, he appeared as a successful professional, a perfect dad, a loving husband, and a perfect neighbour to others. But what he did in private was commit cold-blooded murders. He went around killing people, gay men, and buried them in his own property, which is nothing but the Fox Hollow Farms. Once he knew he was getting closed down by the police, he fled to Ontario and killed himself. In his death note, he mentioned that he was killing himself because of his failing business and marriage. Police would end up finding multiple bodies on the property. The property was then purchased by a private investor who removed all of Baumeister's belongings from it. The house was later put on the market, but it failed to attract any buyers. People would come, look at the house, and then end up not buying it because of its dark history. The agent told them that the house's dark history was the reason for its cheap price. Unlike the others who rejected the house previously, the Graves ended up buying it. 2 weeks later, the family moved into the house and instantly fell in love with it. The teenage sons especially loved spending time in the swimming pool of the house. They would playfully run around and bring dirt and gravel into the pool while getting back into it. So one day, Vicky was vacuuming around the pool, cleaning up the mess the boys had made, and the vacuum cleaner stopped working all of a sudden. When she turned around, she saw the power cord plugged out of the socket. She thought to herself that she might have jutted out the cord accidentally, plugged it again, and resumed the vacuuming. Within just a few moments, the power cord was plugged out again, but this time, it was almost a foot away from the socket. She wondered how she could have jutted it out so far accidentally, plugged it again, and continued vacuuming. This time, she kept looking over her shoulder to see why it was getting plugged out, and she saw it getting thrown out of the socket right in front of her eyes. She was startled by it and went back into the house, dropping the vacuum on the spot. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees named Joe was constantly turning up late for work. As he couldn't tolerate this behavior anymore, he confronted Joe and asked him the reason for always turning up late. Joe told him that he lived over an hour away, and that was the reason he couldn't be on time for work. After thinking it over for a brief period, Rob offered Joe to rent an apartment attached to his residence. Joe readily accepted and moved into the apartment a couple of days later with his dog Fred. Tired from the transportation of his goods, Joe went to bed early that night. That night, he had a dream where he was being chased by someone unknown, and this made him sleepwalk. He started running away from the apartment in a half-lucid state and tumbled onto the ground, knocking over a glass that cut his hand really badly. A couple of days later, when Vicky returned home, she found Rob painting a portion of the house. She walked towards him, and the couple started speaking about how beautiful the house would look after he finished painting it. As they were speaking, Vicky noticed a man clothed in a red t-shirt come out of the nearby woods into their property. He stood there eerily staring at them in the house. Before she could tell Rob about it, the man went back into the woods and disappeared. Still, Vicky ended up telling Rob about the man, but Rob told her that it was quite common for a house with such dark history to have stalkers. Vicky accepted this as their new reality and tried to not give much attention to what she had seen. Later that night, as Joe was cleaning up his dishes, he heard someone knock on the door. As Joe was doing his dishes, his hands were full of soap foam and he was washing it off before going to check who was knocking on his door. While he was washing his hands, the knocking got louder and more aggressive. He yelled, "I'm coming!" but the knocks didn't stop. Assuming it was Rob or Vicky calling him for an emergency, he rushed to the door as soon as he could and opened it. When he opened it, all he could see was emptiness. Joe initially thought that it was the work of an intruder and looked at every place he suspected, but he found none. As he walked back towards his apartment confused, he saw someone sitting in his bedroom and his dog stood near his bedroom barking at it. As Joe rushed into the room, the person disappeared. He turned on all the lights to make sure it wasn't a thief, and he found no one inside. Joe was disturbed by the knocks he had heard previously and walked out of his apartment with his dog, seeking a rational explanation. As he walked through the house's driveway, he noticed a man in a red t-shirt walking into the woods. His dog started chasing this man and ran into the woods. Joe couldn't leave his friend in the woods and he followed it into the woods in fear. As he entered the woods, he saw his dog staring at him all silently. In fact, it was staring at something slightly to his side. As he slowly turned his head to see what it was, he saw the man in a red t-shirt standing right next to him. Joe ran out of the woods in fear, and his dog followed him into his apartment. He locked the door and peeked out through his window to see if the man followed him. That night went by with Joe constantly looking out of the window, hoping that the man didn't return. The next day, Joe rushed to Rob and Vicky and informed them about the occurrences of the previous night. When he told them about the man with the red t-shirt in the woods, Vicky immediately connected to him, as she had seen the same person the previous day. That night, Joe was all locked up in his apartment, hoping that the night was not as terrible as the previous night. As he was looking out of the window in fear, he heard someone knock on his door. The knocks were so aggressive that the doors literally rattled. Joe opened the door, and just like the previous night, he found no one. As he stood there looking around, he noticed that the knocker of the door stood perpendicular to the ground, as if someone was holding it. The knocker knocked on the door one last time, with no one near it. Joe swiftly went back into his room and locked the door in fear. As he anxiously looked at the door, he saw the doorknob turn all by itself, and the door burst open. He ran out of the apartment to see who was causing all this, and when he returned back, he saw a man, soaked completely, run out of his apartment right across from him. Scared to death, Joe, along with his dog, rushed into Rob and Vicky's portion and told them what had just happened. The three of them arrived at the conclusion that the house was haunted by the victims of Baumeister and convinced themselves that they would not harm them. But little did they know, it was not just the victims haunting their property. One night, as Joe was working on his computer, he heard noises from his kitchen. When he entered the kitchen, he saw all knives neatly lined up. Joe thought that this was the work of the ghost of a victim, and he felt obliged to help it. So he turned off the AC, took out his iPhone, and started recording. He asked multiple times who was in the kitchen, but got no answers. He laughed at how silly it was, but still transferred the recording to his PC and listened to it. In the recording, he heard a man answer, "The married one." The creepy part is that the only one who was married in Baumeister's case was Baumeister himself. Evil never dies after all. Dave in Capital City Theatre. In 2006, Dave Murphy became a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was Protective Service Officer, which put him in charge of the physical security of the county facilities. His first facility was nothing but the Capital City Theatre. This theatre was a landmark in the city as it had been in it since the early 1900s. Dave met his partner Morgan Matthews when he first reported at the theatre, and he appeared to be an all work, no fun guy. The first thing Morgan did after their meeting was take him to the control room on the first floor of the theatre. The room had monitors that showed the feed of cameras located all around the house. The cameras, however, were not in their best shape and could only tell what was in the frame only if there was ample lighting. Since the lights were almost always turned off during the night, the cameras were literally useless then. Later, Morgan took Dave to the basement of the theatre. Dave was astounded by the sheer size of the basement, and he was creeped out by its eeriness. Standing there was so disturbing that Dave literally ran out of it when they were done with this area. Dave was given a tour of the second and third floors of the theatre as well. Once they were done with the tour, Morgan told Dave about the inspection rounds they had to do twice a day. During these rounds, they had to do a check on all the rooms of the theatre once before dawn and once before dusk. This check was to make sure the doors were locked and the lights were turned off. Once the rounds were complete, they headed back to the control room where they spent the rest of their time. That night, Dave was hopeful that he would get to know more about his partner, but Morgan did not seem interested in speaking to him and cut short every conversation he started. The first obscure event. Morgan accompanied Dave for the first few inspection rounds, and on the night of the third day, Dave set out to do the rounds all on his own. After checking the remaining rooms of the theatre, Dave finally proceeded to check the rehearsal room. This room was located on the third floor of the theatre, and it had no door. He peeked into this room to make sure there was no one inside, and it was then he heard a door across the hallway shut closed. Dave initially thought that it was the work of an intruder and walked towards this door, taking his pistol in his hand. He figured out that it was the bathroom door that shut closed, and he informed Morgan to check if someone was there on the floor on the radio. When Morgan checked the camera feed, he saw no one, but because of the seriousness in Dave's voice, he headed to the third floor to check it himself. As Dave stood near this door investigating, he noticed that the door had a hydraulic hinge. This meant that there was no way someone could have shut it closed. As Dave was about to enter the bathroom in search of the intruder, he was joined by Morgan. The police duo searched every nook and corner of the room but found no one inside. When Dave and Morgan were sure that the intruder was not inside the bathroom, they came to the conclusion that he was running out of the bathroom and slammed the door on his way out. They started investigating the other section of the theatre with their guns still drawn out. As they slowly walked down the stairs, Dave noticed lights turned on in a room on the second floor, and all the other rooms on the floor had their doors wide open. Dave was confused by this sight, as he himself had closed those doors and turned off the lights. The duo's suspicions of intruders grew stronger. However, despite checking the entire theatre 3 times, they could find no trace of an intruder. Morgan petrified. A couple of days later, Morgan was all alone on his shift. While he was in the control room, he heard whispers coming from the hallway behind him. Because of the experience he had 2 days back, he immediately took out his pistol and slowly walked down the hallway in the direction of the whispers. With every step he took towards the whispers, they moved farther away from him. Following the whispers, he eventually reached the stairs leading to the basement. As he neared the basement, the whispers stopped, but he heard someone cough in the basement. Morgan was convinced that it was an intruder and slowly walked into the basement with his gun held high. He checked every room in the basement, but just like the previous time, there was not a single trace of an outsider. As he was walking back to the staircase, he saw smoke coming out of the door of a room beside him. He immediately opened the door and turned on the lights, but he saw nothing abnormal inside. As he searched the room for fire, the smell of smoke slowly dissipated from the air. He checked all the rooms in the basement for fire multiple times, but, as always, there were no traces. Tales of an accountant. A few days later, Dave went quite early for his shift, and when he entered the theatre, he overheard one of the theatre employees speaking about ghosts in the theatre. Dave was intrigued by his conversation and told him about the experience he had. This man, who was an accountant, took Dave to his cabin on the third floor, and narrated the experience on his last night shift. That day, the accountant was all alone in the theatre since it was late in the evening. He was doing his work in his cabin on the third floor when he heard the elevator engine turn on. As he looked out of his cabin through a window to see what was happening, he saw the elevator going to the basement of the theatre and coming back up. As he kept staring at the elevator door, the door opened. He was awestruck by what he saw. The elevator was completely empty. He thought it was routine maintenance and continued with his work. He was disturbed again by the alarms of the elevator, and as he looked out of his cabin again, he saw the elevator door failing to close fully, as if someone was obstructing it. He walked into the elevator out of curiosity, and the moment he was in, the doors closed, and the elevator started moving toward the basement. When it reached the basement, he slowly walked out of the elevator and shouted, "Is anyone there?" in the empty basement. The eerie silence in the basement made him rush back to his cabin. While he was sitting in his cabin thinking about the weirdness he experienced, he heard banging noises from the hallway. As he slowly walked out of his cabin and peeked into the hallway, he saw something that could make him run out of the theatre in fear. Tales of an Accountant continued. As he slowly walked out of his cabin and peeked into the hallway, he saw something that would make him run out of the theatre in fear. He saw all the drawers in a file cabinet situated in the hallways drawn out. And as he stood gazing at the strangeness, all drawers shut closed all by themselves, right in front of his eyes. This scared him so much that he ran out of the theatre, leaving all his belongings behind. Dave's friend visits the theatre. As the paranormal events continued, Dave decided to offer a tour of the theatre to his friend in order to get extra validation. After Morgan approved this idea, Dave called his friend Greg and offered him a tour of the theatre, which he readily accepted. The next day, Greg was greeted by Dave and Morgan at the theatre. The tour started in the main auditorium, and once they were done, they moved into the basement. As they walked through the hallway of the basement, Dave noticed that a door on their left was open. Dave and Morgan immediately pulled out their pistols, aimed at the open door, and slowly walked towards it, with Greg just behind them. When they were about to enter the room, the door shut right in their face. Before they could react, the door handle started to rattle aggressively. Once the rattling stopped, Morgan and Dave broke into the room. Greg, being too scared of staying all alone in the hallway, followed them into the room. While they were looking around the room, Greg gasped and pointed at a corner of the room. He said to the other two that someone was sitting in that counter. But when Dave and Morgan swiftly turned towards the corner, they saw no one. At this point, all three of them were scared to death and ran out of the basement as fast as they could. Once they were out of the basement, Greg decided his time at the theatre was up, and he left it. Morgan quits. After multiple requests, the cameras in the theatre were replaced with better cameras with infrared lights. This meant that the cameras offered upgraded night vision. The very first shift after the camera installations were assigned to Morgan. As he was in the control room getting used to the new system, he noticed a man sitting in the main auditorium of the theatre on the camera feed. The man slowly turned his head towards his camera and stared at it with his glaring eyes. Morgan felt as if this man was directly staring at him. As Morgan watched this man through the feed, he raised into the ceiling and disappeared into thin air. It was the last straw for Morgan, and he raised a request to transfer on the very next day. Dave quits. A few days after Morgan was transferred, Dave had to spend a night all alone at the theatre. After performing the routine rounds, Dave returned to the control room and started monitoring the camera feed. All of a sudden, he heard a piano play. He immediately headed towards the basement since he knew that the only piano in the theatre was located in the basement. As he neared the basement stairs, he pulled out his gun and walked towards the piano in stealth. As he neared the piano, he figured out that the piano was playing on its own. As he took another step towards it, the piano guard shut closed. He instinctively ran out of the basement and, similar to Morgan, raised a request for transfer the very next day. A new officer greeted by the paranormal. After Dave and Morgan forced their transfer, the police department could not find a permanent security officer for the theatre. After multiple failed attempts, they found a veteran officer named Josh Thomas for the job. However, on his very first day of duty, he heard voices in the basement. He went down to check the cause, but despite turning on all the lights and doing a thorough check, he found no one. As he made his way to the third floor, the elevator turned on by itself, went down to the basement, and returned back to the third floor. As Josh stood staring at the elevator door, it opened with no one inside. This event made Josh strongly believe that someone else was in the theatre with him. Since he was the only one on shift that day, he called for backup on the radio. Coincidentally, Dave was in the rounds near the theatre, and upon hearing his call for backup, he immediately went into the theatre to help him. When Dave entered the theatre, he was greeted by Josh's petrified face. Dave asked him not to worry, and the duo proceeded to clear the theatre. They checked all the rooms except the main auditorium, but just as Dave anticipated, there was no one. Before Dave left, they decided to check the main auditorium once. They went into the main auditorium and stood on the stage, chatting with each other. They were positioned in such a way that Dave had his back facing the seats, and Josh was facing him and the seats. Josh suddenly started stuttering and stopped mid-sentence. He was looking over Dave's shoulder with his frightened eyes. When Dave asked what was bothering him, Josh said something was standing behind him. As Dave slowly turned his head, he saw a man standing at the corner, facing the wall. He was looking down, and his head was covered by a hood. By the time Dave completely turned, this man turned around quickly and looked directly at them. He had extremely sunken eyes and a terribly burnt face. He teleported himself to the backside door and disappeared right in front of their eyes. A terrible accident. Desperate to find an answer to the events in the theatre, Dave dug deep into its history. After performing a complete study of the building's history, he got to know about a major fire accident in the theatre in the 40s. During this accident, a man was stuck in the basement and he was burnt to death. Dave was convinced that the phantom of this man was the reason behind all the paranormal events in the theatre. Sebastian witnesses anomaly. The Sierra Madre Oriental is a mountain range that starts from the southern border of Texas and continues 700 miles through the northwest region of Mexico. Almost halfway across this mountain range, on its eastern face, lie a series of caves. Many small isolated villages that are populated mainly by illiterate poor farmers are situated around these caves. On one night in May 1963, a 14-year-old boy from one of these small villages, named Sebastian Guerrero, went out to venture into these caves. He did it quite often, as there was a local belief that these caves had treasure in them. As always, he got out of his house, walked up the mountain, and started walking towards the first cave opening he saw. As he was walking, he saw light come out of a cave opening far away on his right. From what he knew, the caves had never had people visit them before, especially at night. Hence, seeing this light intrigued the young boy. He started walking towards this lit-up cave, and with every step he took towards it, he was getting farther away from his village. As he got closer and closer to the cave, he started hearing a sound that appeared to be the laughs or screams of a person. His curiosity increased, and he walked even faster toward the cave. At about 200 feet away from the opening, he started hearing people singing and chanting in unity, and one person screaming out of extreme pain. Sebastian slowly sneaked into the cave entrance, hid behind a big opening, and peeked into it. What he saw inside terrorized him, and he started running away from the cave as fast as he could. While running, he had a strong sensation that he was being followed. The young boy did not run towards his village, but to a nearby police station that was almost 10 miles away. Sebastian did not even stop running after he broke into the front door of the police station. The police, who were completely off guard, calmed down to the hysterical boy. After he finally composed himself, he opened up to the police about what he had seen. Sebastian and Louis go missing. Sebastian told the police that he saw a vampire inside the cave, surrounded by a group of people. The police, who was serious until then, let out a sigh of relief and told the young boy that he might have had a nightmare and drove him back to his village. When Sebastian woke up the next day, he was not able to get what he had seen in the previous night and was extremely disturbed. So he went back to the police station and asked them to investigate the cave. The police, however, never took him seriously and shooed him away. He repeatedly insisted that something evil and dangerous was there inside the cave, and if they did not intervene, it would take the lives of people. After pleading repeatedly, one officer named Louis Martinez asked Sebastian to take him to the cave so that he would investigate it. Sebastian, who was grateful to this officer, got into the car with him and took him to the cave. Later in the day, the other officers started to grow worried, as Louis and the kid had not returned after heading to the cave. Also, Louis was not reachable on his radio. The police waited for them to return until that evening after lunch. They went to Sebastian's village, hoping that the boy would have returned, but even Sebastian's whereabouts were not known. It was at this point that the police understood that it was an emergency. As they were understaffed, they sought the help of the Mexican military and headed towards that cave in search of Louis and Sebastian. What they saw would shock the entire world. In order to know what they saw inside, let us travel back to December of 1962. The ploy of the Hernandez brothers. Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, two scammers who were also brothers, engineered a plan to grow wealthy quickly. To execute it, they went to a small, isolated village called Yerba Buena, which had only 20 families, and whose primary occupants were illiterate and poor. This village was present right below the cave, which Sebastian and Louis went to investigate. Right before the new year, this scammer duo got into Yerba Buena and put on a dramatic show, telling how they were the prophets of an exiled Inca god. They told them that if they were obedient and did the thing they commanded, this god would bring them wealth. They were extremely good salesmen, and as a result, they convinced the gullible villagers into believing their disguise and obeying them. The villagers believed their words so much that they practically became slaves to the brothers. They gave them anything they wanted and did everything they asked them to do. However, after a couple of months, some of the villagers started to get frustrated with the brothers, as they were losing their wealth instead of gaining some. Also, they were being treated extremely badly by the Hernandez brothers, which made them question if they were really prophets. As this opinion was slowly beginning to become the opinion of the whole village, the brothers who had already looted the village dry decided to try and rescue their mission. Entry of the Suedo goddess. To accomplish this, they went to a close-by city and went in search of prostitutes to aid them with their ploy. Their search ended when they met Magdalena Solis, a prostitute in the city. They told them about their ploy and asked her to pretend as an actual income goddess to instigate belief in the villagers once again. She liked this idea and agreed to do it in exchange for some money. So she, along with her brother, who acted as her pimp, was taken into the village secretly by the Hernandez brothers. The scammer duo dressed her in an Incan goddess costume and hid her in one of the caves in the mountain. Later, they went to the village, gathered up the villagers, told them that they had a special ceremony in the cave, and took them into the cave. After all of them were inside, they created a smokescreen using basic magic tricks and made Magdalena emerge out of it as a goddess. Standing amidst the smoke, she told them that she would kill them all if they dared disobey her. The villagers were intimidated by what she said and ended up completely believing her. The villagers started believing the Hernandez brothers again, and things seemed to work again. Everything went as planned, except for the pseudo goddess's change in attitude. After being a prostitute for a major portion of her life, the way these villagers saw her gave her a sense of control and respect for the very first time. She started herself as a goddess on the village, and this goddess was not really a merciful one. She completely took control over the village by giving death threats and soon rose to the pinnacle of the authority structure, surpassing the Hernandez brothers. Although the brothers didn't like this, they didn't intervene, as they were getting to exploit the villagers the way they wanted. Magdalena's blood rituals. As time went by, the pseudo goddess started to abuse the villagers physically, mentally, and sexually. She started displaying strong sadomasochistic and paedophilic tendencies, and used the villagers to fulfill her extreme fetishes. She also convinced herself that in order to stay a goddess, she had to drink blood. Hence, she demanded the villagers to provide her with blood, which they needed. They slaughtered their farm animals and pets, drained out their blood, and gave it to the pseudo goddess. As the abuses and blood rituals continued, two villagers, in some time of April, felt that they had endured enough and decided to flee the village. The Hernandez brothers, who somehow got to know about this, old Magdalena about it. After getting to know about this, she immediately told the villagers to get into the cave for a special ceremony. Once everyone was in, she pointed at the two who were planning an escape and ordered the remaining to kill them. The other villagers obliged and beat the two of them to death. Once they were dead, Magdalena dragged their corpse to a pike she had set up in the cave and tied them up. She then took a chalice, walked towards the corpses, and pressed it against the bodies to fill it with their blood. Once it was filled, she proceeded to drink it. It was at this point that the pseudo goddess felt that she could drink human blood instead of animal blood. In the oncoming weeks, Magdalena would call the villagers, often for these blood rituals, ask the villagers to kill the one she pointed at and drink their blood. With time, she felt that killing the sacrifices spoils their blood, so she started to tie them up, cut out their hearts while they were still alive, and drink their blood. Sebastian and Louis are discovered. This exact scene is what poor Sebastian saw that night in the cave. The next day, when he and the officer went to the cave to investigate, they would have their hearts carved out by the pseudo goddess, who would drink their blood as well. When the police and armed forces arrived at the cave, they were attacked by the villagers, which led to a shootout. The shootout killed most of the villagers and the Hernandez brothers. Once the shootout stopped, they headed into the cave in search of the boy and the officer. However, they were able to only find their heartless bodies surrounded by pieces of human flesh. After searching the village, they found Magdalena and her brother hiding in a hut. They were later convicted and sentenced to 50 years in jail. In early 1974, a 34-year-old man named Michael Taylor was leading a happy life with his wife Christine and his 5 children in Ossett, West Yorkshire. He was a perfect father and a loving husband with a commendable sense of humour. His neighbours report that they would often hear Michael laughing or cracking jokes while they crossed his house. However, this beautiful family would lose their happiness in the April of the same year. Michael in the Christian Fellowship. One day in April of 1974, Michael was doing some house repairs while standing on a ladder. He accidentally slipped off the ladder and hurt his back badly. Although his injury was not major, it caused chronic pain which changed Michael's personality. The happy, humorous man became extremely depressed and irritable. His behaviour was so bad that his family could barely stay around him. While the Taylors were not religious, most families around them in the locality were. So some of their neighbours, who were also Michael's friends, persuaded him to seek God for healing his ailment. They also specifically suggested a Christian group named the Christian Fellowship. It was a religious group that offered support even during the non-Sundays. The group's leader was a 21-year-old extremely friendly woman named Marie Robinson, and his friends told him that she could potentially be the difference maker in his life. On the 12th of September of this same year, Michael joined the group and he was astonished by the way Marie carried herself and the way people treated her. Praying with this group helped reduce his chronic pain and filled him with happiness again. He started spending more time with this group, which also meant that he was spending more time with Marie. The duo had a strong bond growing between them. They started spending more time with each other, and all Michael told his family about was Marie. The road to exorcism. Their closeness caused rumours about an affair they had. These rumours slowly spread from his religious group to almost all ears in the town. Michael's wife eventually heard these rumours and started suspecting his husband of infidelity. One day, while Michael was praying with the group, his wife burst into the hall where they were praying and shouted at him, asking him to confess his affair. While she was shouting, Michael had his back towards her. He slowly tilted his head towards Marie and started staring at her. Just a few moments after establishing eye contact with him, Marie shouted in fear. She said that he looked nothing like a human. While the whole bunch of people were looking at Marie, Michael started blabbering something in a language none of them knew. He suddenly started running towards Marie like he wanted to kill her. The other members of the group piled up on him to stop him, but he never stayed still. After the people around him prayed for almost an hour, Michael finally fell unconscious and woke up as his normal self. After this event, Marie told Michael and his family that he was possessed and an exorcism should be performed on him as soon as possible. So they reached out to the Anglican Church, which in turn would send two of their best, named Raymond and Peter, for his exorcism. Exorcism and murder. The duo performed the exorcism rituals on Michael for an entire day, by the end of which he was completely exhausted. At the end of the ritual, they told him that he was possessed by 40 demons, and 37 of them were driven out. Since Michael was completely exhausted, they told him they would complete his exorcism the next day. So Michael ended up returning home with his wife that day. A few hours later, one of Michael's neighbours heard strange noises outside her house. When she slightly pulled a curtain aside and peeked through a window, she saw a completely naked Michael Taylor, covered completely in blood. He was walking around yelling praises of Satan. This woman was petrified at the sight and his behaviour and ended up calling the police. When the police arrived, they saw Michael lying near that woman's doorstep in the fetal position. He was giggling like a baby as the officials questioned him. He finally snapped out of the state and looked up at the police officials, all confused. The police then got to know about his identity. After calling for backup, the officials entered Michael's house. The first officer, who entered the house, ran out of it because of the frightening thing he saw inside. What he saw would become the most disturbing crime scene in English history. A few hours after he returned from the exorcism, Michael slipped back into his trance. He became extremely violent and started attacking his wife. He pinned her to the ground and with his bare hands gouged out her eyes and pulled out her tongue. The assault didn't stop there. He tore off her face with his hands and threw it across the room. As the woman was taking her final painful breaths, he smeared the blood oozing out of her once normal face on his naked body and enjoyed watching her die. Aftermath. Michael was convicted, but he was not declared guilty on the grounds of insanity. He spent 4 years in psychiatric care, after which he was sent back to the general population. So was Michael a man possessed by demons, or a demon in man's form? I leave it to your judgment. The Alexanders enter the Lorber Society. In the early 1950s, a young stonemason named Harold Alexander, living in Hamburg, Germany, came in contact with an old man named George. George was the leader of a small religious group called the Lorber Society, which was rooted in the Christian faith. Their views, however, were far more extreme than an average Christian. While most Christians believe in self-denial to gain favour with God, George and the other members of the Lorber Society took this concept of self-denial to the extreme. They practiced it so aggressively that nobody in the society could live a normal life as they prayed to God 24/7. To add on, members of the Lawber Society also believed that anyone who was not a part of them was evil. When Harold met George, he was blown away by him as George was extremely charismatic. George had a similar admiration for Harold, which instantly made them friends. The friendship made Harold and his wife Dragma join the Lawber Society. They wholeheartedly got into this extreme way of life and obediently listened to everything George told them. Harold rises in the ranks of the society. A few days after Harold and his wife joined the society, George was struck by illness and he was nearing his demise rapidly. Harold visited George when George was on his deathbed. When he returned after the meeting, he told his wife that George told him that he was going to be the next leader of the Lawber Society when George died. His wife, along with the rest of the society members, believed this, and when George eventually died, they accepted him as their leader. They revered him just like they did with George and devotionally accepted his words. Frank, a prophet of God. When Harold led the society, he continuously told them the next prophet of God would be returning to Earth, and they should be ready for it. He claimed that he would know immediately when the prophet arrived and order them to do whatever this prophet wanted without question, as it was God's will. In 1953, Harold and his wife Dragma birthed their second child, which was also their first boy, and named him Frank. As soon as Frank was born, Harold decisively said that his son was the prophet they had all been waiting for, and all the members accepted it, without a second opinion. As Frank grew up, he was continually worshipped 24/7 by the members of the Lawber Society, which included his own family members. This had a major impact on his behaviour. By the time Frank was at the age of a grade school child, he fully believed that he was the prophet of God, and he began using that authority to boss around his family, especially his three sisters and his mother. But he was never confronted as he was considered as a prophet of God. The Alexanders flee to Spain. When Frank turned 16, he started feeling the need for sex. But since society thought everyone was out of it was evil, he got a weird idea. Since he didn't want to pollute himself with the evil outside, he went to his father and told him that he wanted to ease his sexual urges by copulating with the family's woman. His father, instead of confronting him, encouraged this idea. To add to the grotesqueness, the family woman readily accepted their new roles as they firmly believed pleasing him was pleasing God. As the weirdness went on, one of Frank's sisters told one of her friends in school about her jealousy when Frank engaged with the other women in the house. This even started rumours about the family's incestual behaviour, which eventually ended with the police catching their trails. Also, the Lawber Society started distancing itself from the family as they dejected the idea of incest. This led to Harold and his fleeing to Santa Cruz, a city on the Canary Islands in Spain. Despite their change in the locality, their belief system didn't change, and they continued worshipping Frank in their small apartment amidst the busy city. A creeped out doctor. 10 months later, on December 22nd, 1970, a wealthy doctor named Walter heard a knock on the door of his villa. When he opened it, he saw two men covered head to toe in something that resembled mud. When he asked what they wanted, they told him that they wanted to meet Sabine, his 15-year-old housemaid, as they were her father and brother. Yes, the two men were Harold and Frank. Heeding their request, Walter called for Sabine, and once she arrived at the door, he started walking away to give the personal space. He suddenly stopped overhearing the terrible things they were speaking about. He started sweating profusely after hearing their conversation and rushed into a room to call the police. When the police arrived, they found Harold and his children calm and composed. This was contradicting, as from what the police heard from Walter, the family cannot be so calm after performing such a hideous act. Harold continued to tell the police about the terrible actions he committed with such calmness that the police were dumbfounded. The police right away headed to Harold's apartment. When they opened the apartment door, they immediately understood that Harold was not bluffing. So what actually happened? It was the killing hour. According to Frank and Harold, women were innately evil, and they could only go to heaven if they were murdered and had their evil organs mutilated. This concept was strongly believed by them, and the women of the family completely accepted it, as according to them, Frank was a prophet of God, and everything he commanded was God's own command. On December 21st, 1970, Harold and his wife were taking a nap in their bedroom. Frank went into their bedroom, sat on the corner of their bed, and kept staring at his mom. His mom incidentally opened her eyes and looked at Frank in a way that he describes as offensive. Offended by their so-called offensive sight, Frank declared the killing hour. He grabbed a wooden coat hanger near him and started beating his own mom on her head. Instead of fighting against the assault, she lied on her back, kept her hands on her sides, and got into a position that made it easier for him to assault her, as it was the killing hour. His father, instead of stopping him, jumped out of the bed, ran into the hall, and started playing his organ in ecstasy. After hitting his mom's head until she fell unconscious, he proceeded to assault his two other sisters until they felt unconscious. Sabine escaped her death as she stayed in the doctor's house that week. While the three women were lying unconscious, Frank went to the kitchen and brought a knife with him. With that knife, he proceeded to cut off the breasts and genitals, according to him, the evil organs, of the still alive women, and nailed them to the walls. He further proceeded to carve out his mother's heart, wrapped it with a cord, and hung it on the wall. By then, the women were all dead, and the father-son duo left their apartment. They would then spend that night in another property of theirs before meeting Sabine. Harold and Frank were put into asylums from which they escaped after 20 years. Their whereabouts after their escape still remain obscure. Have you ever been really, really in love with someone? Where your every waking thought is concentrated solely on them, and the time where you're not with them feels like an eternity, counting down the minutes? Maybe you felt that way. Maybe you haven't. I've had my fair share of relationships where I've had my head messed with over and over. Some of them like playing mind games, others were abusive. Some were hysterical. Some were great, calm, and kind people that I was too broken to love. Then there's Millicent, or Millie. She was too good to be true. I've been part of the workforce for a few years now. I got my architecture degree at Cloud State and moved out to Tomskog, Minnesota for an entry-level job. Small town, nice people, and cheap apartments. When my little brother graduated from Minnesota State, they decided to have a party. He studied law, and he had a class full of future lawyers looking to get some stress out after taking the bar exam. 4 open apartments on the same floor, everyone invited. It was the kind of frat-fueled party frenzy you see in the movies. I can't believe some of the people I met there were aiming for positions of power. I met a guy there who swore he was going to be on the Supreme Court. He did a keg stand 10 minutes later. Legend. That's when I first met Millie. If I'm a solid 6, she would have been an 11. It was hard not to gawk. She had short blonde hair, a Cannibal Corpse t-shirt, and the kind of jeans that you just throw on to get out of the house. She could have been wearing a plastic bag for all I cared. Her almond-shaped face was so unique. She was absolutely gorgeous, with a deceivingly large smile. No piercings, not even earrings, and no makeup. She made her way through the room, seemingly knowing everyone. A beer just magically appeared in her hand, and before I knew it, an hour had passed. I found myself standing beside her in the hallway. Music was thumping all around us, but all I could hear was my own pulse. I've never experienced anything like it before, actual love at first sight. You don't look like a lawyer, she smiled. You are +1. Here with my brother. Was he the one slamming fisherman shots, chatting up Kate in the kitchen? Allegedly. He absolutely was. He was on a 7th shot. Millie was delightful. Seeing that big smile up close was enough to break all the ice in the room. I felt like I could tell her everything, and we ended up talking for hours. I was completely sold. By the end of the night, we were making out in the backseat of my car like teenagers. I'll be the first to admit that I got a bit obsessed with her. I texted her every day, but she always seemed so busy. She hadn't graduated yet. She was getting a master's degree in applied statistics. She didn't seem like the kind of person who would spend hours cooped up in a room with a bunch of numbers, but everything about Millie was a mystery to me. We started dating regularly. Most of the time, we were just going out to eat and watch a movie, nothing big. The night would always end the same though, with a heavy makeout session, sometimes more. She loved just hanging out at my place, even though she thought my scented candles were a bit much. I like sandalwood, sue me. But something was wrong. I've never been very sickly, but I started developing multiple ulcers, and I was losing a lot of weight. I've always had a bit of frail physique, so losing more weight was dangerous. I could barely make it out of bed some days, and I remember once just sitting with a plate of spaghetti in front of me and trying to force myself to eat. It was too painful. I used to love pasta, but at that moment, it looked like I'd opened a can of worms. Of course, when I told Millie about it, she would always come right over. She took care of me for days at a time, helped me cook, clean, make the bed, pretty much everything. She used to bring over this delicious yogurt that made me feel like an actual human for a while. We'd cuddle up and watch Friends for hours on end. And of course, plenty of making out. That goes without saying. But things got worse. It got to the point where I had to be hospitalised and put on intravenous drip, as my body seemed unable to keep food down. My parents drove up to see me. All I could think about was Millie and how worried she'd be. Oddly enough, she didn't come to see me, despite me texting her about it. The doctors talked about a serious vitamin B deficiency. I was given plenty of pills and a strict dietary regimen. I'd be back on my feet and ready to get back to work in a couple of days, he promised. He also told me I had to stop smoking, or I'd develop a serious emphysema. When I told him I didn't smoke, he just shook his head in disbelief. I was given some prescription painkillers. The day I was let out of the hospital, I met Millie in the parking lot. She seemed surprised that my brother was there with me, and the two of them met for the first time. It was an awkward meeting on both sides, no more than a hey. That was it. Later that night, I called him about it. Millie had gone home for the night, but she promised she'd be back after class the following day. My brother hadn't seen us together before, so I figured he was just surprised. I'm happy for you, he said. She's bad news. You're just jealous, I laughed. No, I mean, she has a reputation. Come on. I'm telling you, she's weird. She only dates sick guys. Apparently, she had dated 3 guys who were all very sick. 2 of them had to move out of state for special treatment. The 3rd moved back in with his parents for long-term care. The next time Millie came back to my place, we ended up making out in the bedroom. I couldn't shake the idea that she was dating me for a reason. I noticed I was having a hard time opening my eyes or pushing her away. I was so occupied with those loving little kisses. Finally, I forced myself away to get a good look at her. I kind of wish I hadn't. We stopped kissing suddenly, and I opened my eyes. There was something wrong with her. Her eyes seemed larger, and her pupils were so dilated that her eyes looked black. There was an odd shape to them, similar to that of a frog. It was as if she was looking straight through me. Her mouth was round, leech-like, framed by her stretched, pillowy lips. Her teeth were longer and serrated. Her neck seemed elongated to the length of my forearm. We weren't actually tenderly kissing. She was holding me down. She had wrapped her legs around me like a tick and dug her spiky fingers into my back. A thin stretch of black smoke rose from her nose. It dawned on me. We had never just kissed or made out. She'd done this to me 100 times. She would lull me into this hypnotic state and then just suck the life out of me like a leech. She would blow white smoke into my lungs and then inhale black smoke back into herself. We would lie there, her breathing through my body for hours. I couldn't remember anything but a pleasant night with a pretty girl, as my body was flooded with hormones and adrenaline, drained of whatever she needed from me. The painkillers must have made it easier for me to wake up. I'd woken up like this before briefly, and every time she would just clamp down and make me forget again. Millie was inches away from my face. She held me down, but I managed to free my arm. I pushed my hand against her face. She shrieked. Not a scream, but a weird shriek. She was inhaling air through what sounded like 3 different windpipes, making a flute-like reverse yell. I was coughing up black smoke, and she tried to suckle up every puff. I managed to roll over, but she clung to me like a backpack. I felt that round mouth trying to attach to me, but I was moving too much. She was surprisingly light, but far stronger than me. I could feel her arms and legs around me clinging. She had 4 other limbs, long bone-like appendages, shiny from some kind of grease. She lifted us off of the floor, her arms and legs holding me like a cocoon. The round mouth got a hold of my neck, and for a split second we were back on the bed making out. Tender kisses and sweet whispers, but we weren't. I was being flooded with hormones. My head is dipping in and out of consciousness. As I coughed up the final puff of black smoke, I felt my mind clearing. With my free arm, I grabbed the candle lighter on my nightstand. Maybe she didn't actually care about the scented candles so much as the lighter. I twisted my arm in a weird angle and turned on the lighter. I set her signature Cannibal Corpse t-shirt on fire. She let go and fumbled away. She tore off her shirt, and I could finally see her for what she really looked like. This wasn't the girl I'd seen at the party. Her face was longer and smoother. Her midriff was thin, stretchy, and ribbed like an earthworm. Her entire body vibrated with every shallow breath. 6 eyes in the middle of a torso, 2 columns of 3. They all blinked and moved independently. There were veins where there shouldn't be, oddly shaped appendages, translucent skin. She was spasming, scrambling to look human. I had a few seconds before she regained her composure. I just kept lighting things on fire. The bed, the drapes, the carpet. With every lick of flame, she'd just shriek more. "I want you back," her head cried. 3 windpipes, no longer trying to emulate the sound of a unified voice. "I'll be careful. You won't remember." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear her. The smoke alarm went off. Millie didn't even stand on her legs anymore. She folded her arms and legs into herself. Her head leaned back into her neck, fitting perfectly into an unnatural angle. A ball of Millie, held up by sticky bones coming out of her sides. The sounds were coming from her hollow neck. "I want to watch Friends," she cried, every valve vibrating. "I want a snack. I want a cuddle." In a last-ditch effort to get to me, she forced herself through the fire. I locked myself in the bathroom. I'd rather die of smoke inhalation than from whatever she turned out to be. She kept pounding the door. A smatter of splats and thuds, but the door didn't budge. The fire alarm was going crazy, and soon the pounding stopped. She was gone. This was a few years ago, but I still can't kiss anyone with my eyes closed. I have nightmares about that black smoke filling up my body, then getting sucked out. It was like someone giving me mouth to mouth, their air blowing out of my nose. That face breathing through me like an extension of their lungs. Her flirty eyes, nothing more than a trick to get close to me. Pretty little lips wrapped around a monster's mouth, too large for a human cranium. I don't think I'll ever get over it. I can still feel my body aching to get back to her. My body loved Millie. Knowing what really happened and what she is the only defense I have from trying to find her again. It would be so easy to just let go, to let her have me, but I'd be dead. But of course I have doubts. Maybe she really cared. Maybe she would be more careful if we tried again. See how easy it is? Never again. I'm telling you this as a warning. If someone seems too good to be true and makes you feel better than you've ever felt, maybe there's a reason. Just open your eyes every now and then. Take a good look. Is this really happening?